the traits on Paul's fruit of the Spirit list in Galatians 5 that we have been traipsing through for 2 months, the one that I've found the hardest to pin down is gentleness, or as some translations have it, meekness. Jesus says the meek will inherit the earth. Jesus is described as being meek when he rides into Jerusalem on the donkey's back on Palm Sunday. And in Matthew 11:29, Jesus describes himself as he says, "Take my yoke upon you and learn of me, for I am gentle and lowly in heart, and you shall find rest for your souls." First Peter gives us a little bit of a clue in saying, "But let it be the hidden person of the heart, with the imperishable jewel of a gentle and quiet spirit, which is in the sight of God of great price. So there's a lot of dancing around the word, but it's hard to get at what gentleness or meekness actually is. If you look up meekness, it says it means gentleness. If you look up gentleness, it says it means meekness. There is no parable of the gentle shepherd or other story that I could find in the Bible that shows that word in action to give us a little bit bigger picture. So I keep asking myself, what is it? What is the essence of gentleness? If you're not riding a donkey into Jerusalem, what does it look like in human life? And how is it different than something like, say, kindness, which is a different word on Paul's list, and Paul is pretty particular when he writes. He's not just writing a bunch of synonyms. He has something different in mind. So I've left it for last in this series, as I've struggled with that question. And while there's still more nuance, I think I can now come a little bit closer. I found it a bit easier to grasp if I put off thinking about gentleness or meekness in humans and see where we do and don't use those words for other parts of the natural world. Once I did that, some things came into better focus. In nature, we use the word gentle when something powerful is not exhibiting its full power. A gentle breeze, a gently flowing stream, gentle ocean waves. But we do not talk about gentle grass, because unlike wind and water, grass doesn't rise up and kill you when it gets in a mood. So it seems to have something to do with the ability to have power, but showing less of it at times. There are whole classes of animals that we associate with gentleness, like deer, because even though every animal has some built-in defense mechanism, and it is not unknown for a strong buck to kill a person when threatened, deer are prey, not predators. There aren't poems about gentle tigers for the same reason there aren't poems about fearsome rabbits unless you're in Monty Python and the Holy Grail. Just saying. Tigers are predators, rabbits are prey, and it's the prey animals that we tend to call gentle just as a rule. Gentleness has an inverse relationship, it seems, to power in some way. When we get to domesticated and working animals, we begin to notice that unless they're severely restrained or ill-treated, many powerful animals make choices on when to exercise their full power or hold back. We will use the adjective gentle for a particular horse on specific occasions, but not as a rule for the species, because a horse can very much be not gentle when it decides. Same with dogs, same with elephants. What all of that tells me is that a core element of gentleness is tied somehow to self-control, which happens to be the word that sits next to it on Paul's list in Galatians. If you're talking about gentleness as a virtue, it doesn't seem to exist outside of a relationship that has a power differential, with the word gentle only valid when exhibited by the one with the greater power, at least in any given moment. When I put all of that together with my own understanding that all the fruit of the Spirit at their core are expressions of love in certain circumstances, my working definition for gentleness, at least for now, is this: gentleness as a spiritual fruit rather than an innate characteristic exists when something is free to unleash its power, but holds back in order to help something it loves, which would be harmed by that power's full expression. A very common example of that is teaching a young child to be gentle with a new baby, whether it's a new baby brother or a puppy or a baby bird. Even 3-year-olds are stronger than quite a few precious things and could do harm if they let their full power loose on them. Often love, self-restraint, and gentleness are taught together with children, especially if they're in the why stage. We first interrupt a show of strength that is too much for the situation and model holding back. No, honey, we don't slap the puppy. We pet the puppy, or we stroke the puppy. Why? Because we don't want to hurt the puppy. Why? Because we love the puppy. Why? Because God made the puppy. And you can go on as long as you have the patience, which is another quality on that list, to do so. All gentleness involves restraint, self-control. But it's also, as all spiritual matters are, about relationship. If your 3-year-old is punching the wall, a conversation is necessary. But while it might be a gentle conversation between you and your child, it would be unusual to use the word gentle when explaining about how to deal with walls. Gentleness might come up if the child's wrath has broken a family heirloom, as a number of objects signify to us a relationship of some kind. But most walls have functional, not sentimental value, and we're more likely to talk about being careful with objects rather than being gentle with the wall or the chair. Gentleness involves restraining our power in relationship. But I think there are 2 other key elements. First, we must do so freely. It must be self-control, not outside coercion. If exercising my power puts me at risk, and I restrain myself out of fear of consequences, I'm being careful, but I'm not really being gentle. If my right to exercise my power has been stripped from me, legally or illegally or under some kind of threat, I'm not being gentle. I'm being constrained. To be gentle requires being free to act and to make a self-directed decision to limit the force of my action. Gentleness is an act of love, and love cannot be forced and still be called love. Whether we're constrained by guilt or by threat or by handcuffs makes no difference in terms of the definition. Gentleness as a spiritual fruit is a form of love and must be freely chosen to count. The second key element is that we're not being gentle unless we're the ones with the greater power in the relationship. Gentleness is always a form of descent. It's bending low to lift someone or something else that has less power than we do up. That might be a power differential that's inherent in the relationship. A boss to an employee, for example, a parent to a child, a guard to someone in prison. It could also be a temporary difference, a healthy person to a sick person, a person lending aid to someone buried in the rubble of an earthquake. When it comes to the sinful relationship inherent in the power of the privileged over the oppressed, it may well be that it is gentleness alone on Paul's list that can restore right relationship and heal the wounds. Because I think gentleness is perhaps the key that opens the door to humility. Which brings us to the passage from Philippians that Kathy read earlier. Philippians 2, verses 1 through 11, is generally believed by scholars to contain an ancient Christian hymn, the earliest anyone has ever discovered. The actual hymn part in verses 6 through 11, after Paul has encouraged the church in Philippi to have the same love and the same mind as Jesus did, that's where the hymn is. But Paul sums up that mind of Christ in verses 3 and 4. He writes, "Do nothing from selfishness or conceit, but in humility count others better than yourselves. Let each of you look not only to your own interests, but also to the interests of others." Privilege only exists when some people think they are more inherently worthy of life's joys and benefits than others, and then use their power to bake that into the structures of social and political life. If each of us, every one of us, counted others to be better than ourselves in all times and in all places, it would be impossible for privilege and entitlement to ever take hold. It's what Jesus was trying to illustrate when he told the parable of the banquet in Luke 14, warning his listeners that when they were invited to a banquet, they should not jockey for the most important seats, because somebody more important than them is bound to walk through that door, and then they're going to be humiliated and asked to move down. Instead, Jesus said, assume everybody who's coming is better than you, and go seek out the least place, sit there, and you got a pretty good chance of being honored as you're asked to move up. Jesus ends that parable by saying, "For everyone who exalts himself will be humbled, and he who humbles himself will be exalted." It's a theme that Jesus expresses in other places as the first will be last and the last will be first. That humility, that descent, that willingness to take the lowest place, if it existed in everyone, would end hate and supremacist groups overnight. But for Paul, that descent does not mean self-debasement, since he follows the instruction to see others as better by saying, quote, "Let each of you look not only to your own interests, but also to the interests of others." He doesn't say don't look to your own interests. He says don't look only to your own interests. Others share this planet with us. Include them in your thought and in your actions. And then, starting in verse 6, Paul quotes from what is believed to be the hymn that presumably the congregation in Philippi that was receiving that letter all knew well. The amazing grace of the time. To illustrate what living with that attitude looked like, saying that Jesus, quote, "though he was in the form of God, did not count equality with God as a thing to be grasped," or in the translation Kathy read, a thing to be exploited, "but emptied himself, taking the form of a servant, being born in the likeness of mortals. And being found in human form, he humbled himself and became obedient unto death, even death on a cross." Therefore, God has highly exalted him and bestowed on him the name which is above every name, that at the name of Jesus every knee should bow in heaven and on earth and under the earth, and every tongue confess that Jesus Christ is Lord, to the glory of God the Father. This hymn in Philippians, I think, is the corrective to those who hear words like humility, gentleness, and meekness as negative. Many equate those words with those who are oppressed, poor, weak, or deemed to be without value in society, as if it's humility and gentleness that got them there. But the downtrodden condition of those Jesus called the least of these are not who Paul is describing as having the virtue of humility, because the poor, the foreigner, and the hungry have no choice. They are, by definition, blocked from bettering their situation by those a particular society favors and who now profit from keeping them underfoot. The humble are not the ones suffering at the bottom of the ladder. The humble are those who are guaranteed a spot at the top, who willingly give up that place to go down and help the others up. Verses 6 and 7 in Philippians 2 are critical here. Jesus was not humble because he was born into a poor family in an occupied country. Jesus was humble because Jesus was God, but freely chose not just to limit his power, but to actually take the form of and be born as a lesser being, a human being. And not a human king either, but someone toward the bottom of the social ladder of his time. And then, even from that state, Jesus keeps descending, hanging out with women, with tax collectors, with sinners, with lepers, with Samaritans, and every kind of outcast and marginalized group, until he finally allowed himself to literally be made nothing, to be executed as a common criminal for the sake and love of the world. Humility requires that a person be fully aware of their own value and inherent worth, and voluntarily accept a lesser status for the sake of being in solidarity with others who have less standing, less of whatever it is. A very recent and public example of humility was in the living quarters for Pope Francis. He was the Pope. He was expected to live in the apartment set aside from those who hold the office, a lavish residence, the Apostolic Palace, it's called. Popes have lived there for centuries. Pope Benedict XVI lived there, and now Pope Leo XIV is going to live there as well. The papal apartment in the Apostolic Palace has more than a dozen rooms, staff residences, and a grand view overlooking the city of Rome. The apartment is adorned with a huge golden altar and icons and works of fine art. The Sistine Chapel is merely one chapel that is part of the Pope's official house, to give you an idea of how much of a palace the Apostolic Palace is. Pope Francis not only could have chosen to live in the papal apartment inside the Apostolic Palace, he was expected to live there. Nobody would have batted an eye if he had gotten off the balcony and walked his way into those apartments. But he did not. Instead, he lived in the Vatican guest house called St. Martha's House. If you go to a site called popehistory.com, you can pictures of the ornate papal apartment in the Apostolic Palace versus the simple room in the guest house where Pope Francis chose to live instead. St. Martha's House is the place meant for clergy having business with the Holy See, and it's where the cardinals who participated in last week's conclave stayed. It has been described as intentionally a 3 rather than a 5-star hotel, so that the clergy are reminded not to get too comfortable on their trips to Rome. Staying at that guest house is not a sign of humility for the cardinals or other clergy, because they don't choose it. It's their assigned housing. But living there was a true sign of humility for Pope Francis, because his assigned housing was the grandest living arrangement in all of Vatican City. But he chose St. Martha's house to be in solidarity with those who had less and had no choice in the matter, to practice what he preached. In the Philippians hymn, it says that in becoming human, Jesus emptied himself, not out of loathing for himself, not because anyone made him, but with the full knowledge of his own power and value, he chose it. We see the same trait in Jesus' cousin, John the Baptist, in the 3rd chapter of John's Gospel. John the Baptist had his own set of disciples, and in the second half of chapter 3, John's disciples come to him worried because John's poll numbers seem to be slipping. Jesus is getting more disciples than John, and in fact, some of John's own disciples have switched over and have gone to Jesus. So John's disciples are in a panic. John responds to their concerns in chapter 3, verses 29 and 30, with something that no politician would ever say in such a situation. He who has the bride is the bridegroom. The friend of the bridegroom, who stands and hears him, rejoices greatly at the bridegroom's voice. Therefore, this joy of mine is now full. He must increase, but I must decrease. Learning to say that, he must increase, I must decrease. They must increase, we must decrease. That's the essence of humility, which may well be the full flowering of all of the Spirit, all of the fruits of the Spirit put together. Certainly learning to be gentle, choosing to restrain our own power in order to be able to love and nurture someone or something that struggles, is a stepping stone to be able to say, with joy no less, I must decrease. It is, I think, one of the key lessons of aging, and ultimately of gracefully giving our earthly bodies back to the earth's embrace. Gentleness, meekness, humility are not signs of weakness, but of strength, of the Spirit. If you have ever tried to limit the expression of your own power for the sake of others, you know it is much harder to hold back and accept less than to forge ahead just because we can, or because it's expected, or because we have earned every right to go on. To force someone to empty themselves through exploitation, oppression, humiliation, violence, theft, guilt, or other subtle or obvious means is soundly condemned by Jesus. And the arc of the entire Bible shows a growing awareness of God's disapproval and finally rage at such behavior. But when the powerful empty themselves by their own free will, giving up something they have every right to take for themselves out of love for another, that is the model of Jesus. That is the mind of Christ. And the counterintuitive message of the gospel is that such emptying is what enables us to be filled with the power of the Holy Spirit to save the world. It is the Good Friday that leads to Easter. As best I can tell, cultivating the fruit of gentleness by learning to tap into love to restrain our power lest it break something more fragile is the first step towards salvation. Amen.